O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are discussing two lesser-known individuals of church history that made a major impact on the church at large. One of them, a hymn writer. The other, a writer of books on prayer. So we're going to be discussing Philip Bliss and E.M. Bounds. What's interesting about these two individuals, these two men of God, is that one of them, I don't know if he was involved in the Union Army, but one of them is a Northerner, a Yankee.
He was.
If I remember correctly, yeah. He helped with the Union Army during the Civil War.
Well, he got drafted like right at the end, so he basically did nothing, but he officially was in the Army.
Gotcha.
He was in the Army for a couple weeks, basically.
Okay. And then that's Philip Bliss, and then E.M. Bounds was a Confederate chaplain. So we have a Northerner and a Southerner. Both of them grew up Methodist, except Philip Bliss became more of a Baptist later on.
I think, didn't you go to Presbyterian? I think his wife was a Presbyterian, and he joined her church.
You can, if you can recall that information, we'll talk about that. But so Bliss was an itinerant evangelist, hymn writer, and singer, while E.M. Bounds was an ordained professional pastor for most of his life, and an author. So we're going to start off with Philip Bliss. You might recognize the hymn Man of Sorrows. Man of sorrows, what a name for the Son of God who came. That's one of his famous hymns. He has a bunch of others, such as Jesus Loves Even Me.
Yep. He wrote the music to It Is Well.
Right, It Is Well With My Soul. He
didn't write the
lyrics, but the music. Let's see here. What
unto him who hath loved us.
That's not a familiar one.
Oh, okay. I will sing of my Redeemer.
Right, I will sing of my Redeemer.
We'll talk about that.
And there are other ones that are very popular, that have been popular in the past, at least, that he composed. So we'll start off with Philip Bliss. He was born 1838.
1838.
38. Okay. In Rome, Pennsylvania, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, Rome, Pennsylvania. His family appears to be very poor, although he, I think, if I remember correctly, did he do very well in school? They weren't able to provide much of an education for him.
Basically, starting out from the beginning, they were very poor. At age 10, there's a story about when he first heard a piano, that he didn't even know what it was, that he was going door to door selling vegetables from his family, trying to make a little income for his family, and he heard a piano, and he was so drawn to it that he just walked into this house and stood there at the door listening to it. And when there was a lady playing it, and when she stopped, he goes, "Please," he basically is like, "Please play another one." And the lady turns around shocked that this boy has just come in, and she just yells at him to get out of her house with his bare feet because he didn't have shoes, But basically, he was just so entranced by that, and he was already obviously had an ear, was very gifted at music, even if he hadn't really gone too far into it. But then the next year, at age 11, he left his home to go work
in a lumber camp
and provide for himself, because his family was so poor that it was just when you're able to. And supposedly he was a very large man. I mean, boy. Yeah. Well, I mean, just very tall, not fat at all, but very tall. And even as a boy, he was already very strong, large, able to at 11 be go work at a lumber camp.
Well, he did start off as a cook.
He did.
To be clear.
I think
then he moved. I think
he did that for 2 years. So at 13, he's actually working in a lumber camp.
Right, and he was saved at age 11 as well, right?
11 or 12, but yeah, basically in the camp.
In the camp.
Yeah, Methodist preachers on the circuit would come and have like revival meetings,
Right.
and he would attend all of them because his parents were Christians.
Right.
The little bit of reading he had learned was taught through the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
And I think his family would sing like every day, every night, and his father taught him how to pray. So he would attend all the revival meetings, and at age 12 he was converted.
Mm-hmm. And then he apparently joined a Baptist church in Cherry Flats, Pennsylvania, wherever that is.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah. At age 17, so he basically was like self-educated and would
right before that.
And would
he attended school and learned music like
Yeah.
however he could.
But so by age 17, he knew he didn't want to be a lumber mill worker.
Mm-hmm.
And he had completed the requirements to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he left that and went to go teach.
And he went to upstate New York, actually far western New York, west of Elmira. And no one listening will really, unless you live around there, you won't really understand the area. But it's a podunk town that he taught at, and he met G.J. Towner in 1857, the leader of a vocal school, and Towner began to actually give Bliss formal training, and then Bliss went to a music convention in Rome again, and he met William Bradbury, who was another composer, and Bradbury actually wrote the song, I believe, "Jesus Loves Me." This I know, along with some others. He actually decided to give up his secular pursuits and devote himself fully to sharing the gospel at that point.
Yeah, largely through music.
Right. Yeah, he by composing music. Although when he started composing music, it was not explicit. It was not geared necessarily towards making hymns. It was actually secular. The first song he composed was actually, it was not explicitly Christian.
First song he composed that was actually published too, or I don't know if published is the word for a song. He sent it in, and with a letter saying that if you deem this song worthy, for my payment, I would like you to send me a flute. And he got a flute. They sent him a flute through the mail.
Right. It must have helped him to compose his music, to get the notes. In 1858, I became a teacher at some kind of academy, and he met his wife, his future wife, Lucy Young. She was a poet, and she also grew up in a musical family. And she encouraged him greatly, and they together went around teaching music and singing, performing music. He was a tutor of music students. He was a traveling music teacher. In 1860, he attended the Normal Academy of Music in New York, which is a pretty
little story about that too. Mm-hmm. Somebody kind of told him, like, I really think this would help you. You should go to this. So he was really interested, but then he found out it cost like $30, which was more than he had at the time. And so he was kind of down, and his wife's grandmother, he was like over at her place or something they were visiting, and she found out about it, and she's like, how much does it cost? And he says, around $30. And she goes, that's a lot of money. And she's like, but for years I've been putting little silver pieces whenever I get extra in this stocking, so go check and see how much is in there. And there was well over 30. And so she says, take it, go. And so he was able to go to it.
Cool. Yeah, let's see here. He went to the academy. Apparently it was only a 6-week course, but he didn't really start to get big with his music performances until 1865, after the Civil War ended. He was holding music conventions. He was conducting singing schools, and also doing concerts with his wife. And actually, by that time, he had moved to Chicago. And in 1869, he, on a Sunday evening, they were walking to church, a Sunday evening service, and they heard D.L. Moody, the famous evangelist, preaching in the open air. and he was going to have a meeting in the building where they were meeting, and they decided to go there. And there were apparently no one there was a very good singer, so he stood out among everyone. Yeah. And at the end of the meeting, D.L. Moody asked him if he would be willing to lead. Kind of compelled him to lead the singing from then on at D.L. Moody's meetings. So from that point forward, Bliss was on the path toward becoming a music evangelist type thing. Yeah. Sharing the gospel through music, and by this time he was composing hymns. He actually became the choir master of the First Congregational Church in Chicago the next year in 1870. And he wrote a lot of hymns, and a lot of them were evangelistic hymns. And he also became the Sunday school superintendent at that church in Chicago, and he composed a Sunday school book called The Charm, which has over 100 hymns in it for Sunday school children. At that time, Sunday school was not for adults; it was only for children. And then D.L. Moody invited him to go to England on D.L. Moody's preaching tours to be the music director. He declined at first, and then Moody invited him again in 1873, and he wanted to see if this was actually what he wanted to do. And apparently there was a guy named Major Whittle. I believe Major is his actual first name, and he joined with him in revival services, evangelistic services. And Philip Bliss decided that this was what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. He wanted to use his music in order to preach the gospel at evangelistic meetings. And he gave up the music conventions he was doing. He gave up writing non-Christian songs and his musical teaching position. And he decided to be a full-time evangelistic singer. So they formed a gospel team, Major Whittle and Bliss. They made a songbook that they sold, and the royalties added up to $30,000, which Bliss used for the ministry.
Yeah, I remember reading that in total, from the royalties of the different hymns he had written, he had donated $60,000 to different ministries and such. And there was even a case where Dwight Moody was arguing with him to keep $5,000 so that he could finally, build a house or get a house for him and his wife and I don't know if they had their 2 kids yet. They were pretty young when they passed away. And he absolutely refused. He was like, no, this money is for the ministry. I will not take any.
Yeah, so he was a very humble, generous man, obviously. He actually joined forces with Ira Sankey, who was he was the famous music composer for Moody. He wrote many songs. He actually composed a lot of the music for Fannie Crosby's lyrics in her hymns. They created another hymn book called Gospel Hymns and Sacred Songs. Bliss then, when he returned from England, he joined...
No, Bliss didn't go to England.
Oh, he didn't?
No.
Oh, this is false information I'm reading.
Hold on. Ira Sankey, basically, Dwight Moody...
Oh, okay.
Asked Bliss to go to England.
Right.
Said no. Ira Sankey went with Dwight,
okay.
And that's how they get. How they get connected.
And then came back.
And then they came
Ira
back.
Sankey came back.
Yeah. And so then they're still Bliss is still friends and connected to them,
right.
But not just like.
Oh, okay.
Ira Sankey's the main singer.
I just read that wrong. Okay. So Bliss and Major Whittle, they continued their evangelistic endeavors. They had 25 in total across the states of Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Minnesota, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And in 1876, Bliss sang at Moody's evangelistic meeting in Chicago, where he actually sang to 1,000 preachers who were there. And he showcased his new hymn, the famous one, "It Is Well With My Soul."
Well, and so a little note on that too is that's kind of shows how highly thought of he was at the time. That you have a couple well-known preachers like Moody, like the guy who was with, that are well connected in that area of Christendom, and they've got the hymn "It Is Well With My Soul," the text for it, and they felt that it could be a pretty good one, so they look around for like, somebody needs to write music for this, and they go to Philip Bliss. So that just kind of shows you he was very well respected.
Right. Well, as he should have been, because he was so experienced and such a gifted.
And you guys know the song. It turned out well.
A gifted musician. Well, hopefully you know the song. It is well with my soul when sorrows. What is the first line?
Oh boy. Hopefully we know the song.
Oh well. We'll leave it to you to look it up.
It is well anyway.
Yes, it's very well known, but I haven't sung it in a long time. He also apparently
When sorrows like sea billows roll.
Right.
There we go.
He also conducted a evangelistic service for a prison in Michigan for 800 inmates. This is 1876. And he was in Pennsylvania for the winter there for Christmas, and he was planning on returning to Chicago in January to work with Moody, and actually he was asked to come back early, and so they took it. Him and his wife took a train. They had left their children to stay with the
grandparents.
Yeah,
and the children, I believe, were 4 years old and 1 year old at the time.
Okay. Yeah, and on December 29th, 1876, they were on the train in Ohio. The train went over a bridge, and because there were a lot of floodwaters, the passenger car fell. The bridge collapsed, and the passenger car fell a total of 75 feet. And it was burning. They had oil lamps, right?
So as it fell and the oil gets all over, so it's not only falling into icy water, it's also on fire.
Yeah, but Bliss managed. So the reason that they knew this is they were looking from the top.
Well, so that one's unverified.
Oh, okay.
Some people say that they saw. Somebody said they saw him.
Oh, okay.
But like I said, unverified. But you can share it anyway.
Well, it seems to people have bought into it at least.
Yeah, I heard both. I heard both ways.
Seems likely. Well, the story is that Bliss was okay. He got out of the passenger car, and then he realized his wife was caught in the seats of the car, and so he went back in while the car was on fire, and they both burned in the flames as he was trying to rescue his wife.
So a little bit on that is, it's the Ashtabula River Railroad disaster. It is the second most deadly transportation accident in American history. 92 passengers died. There were a few survivors, but most of the survivors were pretty injured as well. Nobody really made it out unscathed.
But what's amazing about it is that so apparently the cargo car that held their luggage reached their destination, and all of Philip Bliss's cargo or luggage was intact, including all of his hymns, his final hymns. So they actually got to Chicago, except for him. And then they held the funeral.
And let us say too, so what they found in those hymns was the song "I Will Sing of My Redeemer" that he hadn't shared with anybody yet.
Okay.
And so that was actually one of the only ones he didn't write music for, because he had only written the text for it. And so then they took the music and they looked for somebody, to basically be like, somebody has to put music to this for Philip Bliss. And so we get, do you know that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will sing of my Redeemer and his wondrous love for me. On the cruel cross he suffered, paid my debt to set me free, or something like that. I don't know if that's the original tune, but that's the tune.
No, I was looking it up. That was the one. That was the one. I'm glad you knew it, because otherwise I'd have had to try to sing it.
Right. So he was 38 years old when he died. You know what's just a side note? What's interesting? it seems like a lot of famous musicians die in tragic transportation accidents.
That's why I didn't go into music.
I mean, you can think, if you know of contemporary Christian music, that history. Keith Green, who's a famous, he was one of the pioneers of contemporary Christian music. He died in a helicopter crash, and then you have the guy
Rick Mullins.
Rich Mullins.
Rich Mullins, yeah.
I don't know how he died. It was
a car crash, I think.
But so let's see here.
So I got a couple things to add there.
Okay.
So actually, after he and his wife died in the accident in Chicago, they took up a collection for their children, and $110,000 were given to them.
Wow.
And they may have dispersed it a little bit more than that because that's a lot of money. But this tells you that in Chicago, basically it rocked their world.
Right.
I mean, and Dwight Moody was literally waiting for them to meet them the next day.
Right.
And he wrote a long thing for them. And one of the things because I listened to it, and one of the things he said basically is and we're pouring over all of his hymns to try to pick some for the funeral, and he's like, it's fitting, but and we're trying to find ones that are more somber, but there aren't, because he was just basically said he was just such a happy person, so joyful and so humble, that it was hard to find hymns that met the occasion of his death.
Right.
And then I also wanted to go over a couple of the different songs, a couple stories behind them. Let's see. So one was "Hold the Fort," which was based on the Civil War. This is during Sherman's march to the sea, as they're taking different forts. If they're important, he leaves a few people behind, and he leaves. I forget what fort it was.
A few meaning hundreds.
Yeah, just, yeah, not like 5, but hundreds. Not a huge hit on his total numbers, just enough to hold the fort. And he keeps going, but the General Hood from the Confederates loops around to take back the fort with their full forces, and they basically the few hundred that are there go into the inner fort and are just trying to hold out. Supposedly the commanding officer had been wounded 7 times, and they are about to raise up the white flag, and General Sherman managed to get a signal to them that says, "I'm 15 miles away, hold the fort." And Bliss took this occasion to write a hymn about it. Well, not about that, but to turn it into a spiritual thing. Basically to say, hold the fort, Christ is coming. And another one was a story he heard about an evangelist that met a very poor person and gave him $5 and got his address, and then a month or 2 later writes him a letter, and it has $5 in it, and at the end of each one he says, "More to follow." And he wrote this hymn that was basically about how God's grace and God's provision for us is kind of just more to follow was the name of the hymn. More to follow, where it just we just keep getting more, and it just keeps us going. Another one was "Let the Lower Lights keep burning," I think it was. And this was a story about in the Cleveland Bay there were two lighthouses. One was considered the upper lights, and one were the lower lights. And there was a bad crash of a boat because the lower lights had gone out. And so he wrote a hymn basically saying the Lord is the upper lights that never goes out, but let the lower lights keep burning. That's us. And then one other one that I thought was interesting, not really the story behind it, but where did it get to? So he wrote a hymn called "Pull for the Shore," and when the passengers on the Titanic were in the ones in the lifeboats, to keep their spirits up, they sang that hymn.
Interesting. Another famous hymn, a couple of other famous hymns from him are "Dare to be a Daniel" and "Wonderful Words of Life." So that's Bliss in a nutshell. If you don't sing his hymns, you should definitely consider them. At least sing them privately, or at least read them, because they are a treasure for the body of Christ. Let's see here. What time do we got? We're going to take a short break, and then when we come back, we'll be discussing in the remainder of the episode E.M. Bounds, the man and author of prayer. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. We are back with our section on E.M. Bounds. E.M. Bounds, unlike Philip Bliss, was a Southerner. Where did he grow up?
Missouri.
Oh yeah, Missouri, that's right. In 1835, so only 2 years before Bliss, he was born. The fifth of 6 children. He actually, his dad was named Thomas Bounds. They moved west, and they were devout Methodists. His dad, Thomas Bounds, actually helped to found the town of Shelbyville, Missouri, and was elected the county clerk.
Which actually, first I'll say, they say, so E.M. Bounds is Edward McKendry.
Yep.
And then, so, nobody said this explicitly, but most people assume this, is that McKendry, that he was named after William McKendry, who was a famous evangelist at the time, who had basically had the circuit of Lake Missouri, and founded, as Missouri was being founded, was the one going to all the outskirts of the state and sharing the gospel there.
Cool. And then when Bounds was, I guess, a teenager, well, after his dad died when he was 14.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I will say too, because his father was the county clerk and was a prominent man in the town, they were fairly well off until that point.
Right.
And they had, I think they paid like somebody else's slave girl to come and help them. Just as you'll see, just to see a bit on their view on slavery, which in E.M. Bounds did not agree with slavery. But anyway, they were fairly well off until his father died.
Right, and then he and some of his brothers went west in 1849 to the California Gold Rush to try to make money for their family.
Yeah,
I'm guessing, and while they were believers, but most of the people there who were trying to get rich were not believers, and they realized how
believers supposedly
nominal believers.
Yeah, nominal believers, because he was converted a little bit later on.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So they worked there. Apparently, they didn't get rich.
Yeah, I think they spent 4 years there and were unsuccessful.
Right. He went back to Missouri and he actually studied law to become a lawyer. When he turned 19, he passed the bar exam, and he actually practiced law for 5 years in Hannibal, Missouri. And,
so at 19, when he became a lawyer, he was the youngest lawyer in Missouri. So if that sounds young to you, it still was young back then to be a lawyer.
Right.
I mean, and obviously he's very bright.
Right. Something notable about Hannibal, Missouri, I believe that Ulysses S. Grant actually spent quite a bit of time there in Hannibal. I think there might have been a U.S. armory or something there. But anyway, he was practicing law, and then in 1857, to 1858, there was actually a spiritual awakening that was happening in the U.S. And during that time, let's see here, an evangelist named Smith Thomas preached at a meeting. And E.M. Bounds heard him preaching and apparently received what he described as a second blessing of the Holy Spirit, meaning basically he dedicated himself more fully to the Lord.
So maybe he was saved earlier.
In evangelism. So from then on, from 1858 to then, for the rest of his life, he was devoted to preaching.
Yeah. And so when you say that, basically, when he makes this dedication, he closed up his law office.
Right.
Like completely just, I'm gonna follow the Lord's leading in this.
Right. He was around 20. Yeah, it's
22, I think.
Around 20 at that time. Yeah, he quit the law practice. He actually then studied at the Centenary Seminary of the First Methodist Episcopal Church South in Palmyra, Missouri, for 2 years. And when he completed his time there, in 1860, he became a preacher on a circuit, an evangelist circuit. And then 1861, obviously, the Civil War broke out. He actually was given the assignment by his denomination. So his denomination is the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And they gave him the pastorate to pastor a church called Brunswick Station Methodist Church. It was one of the largest churches in the area. And they were shocked that he, with so little experience, would be assigned to be the pastor there. It was on the Missouri River. It was a growing town. It was actually the hometown of Confederate General Sterling Price. And actually, Bound's oldest brothers, Thomas and Charles, they had joined the Union Army shortly after the war began.
Yeah, so if you remember, Missouri was a border state.
Right.
So that's one of those where if you look at the populations, you have a lot of people fighting for the South and a lot of people fighting for the North. Very mixed opinions. Whereas if you get more in the deep South or way up north, it's more one way or the other. But
right.
in Missouri, there's a lot of different opinions there, and people went both ways.
Right. And Bounds actually had to conduct funerals for both Union and Confederate soldiers. Let's see here.
Yeah, so then he was, I believe it was because the Union got a list of those, basically of like the church roll. I'm not sure exactly how that was. And
church membership.
And no, it was a Southern church, so they basically said in order for you have to pay a bond, $500 bond, or else you get arrested as a non-combatant prisoner. And he didn't even have the money, but he didn't think it was right anyway. And so he was arrested as a non-combatant prisoner of the Union Army. And he spent, I think, 1.5 years in that camp. And during that time, he was ministering to the rest of the prisoners.
Right.
And so then eventually he was freed, basically a prisoner exchange. And he gets left out. In
1862.
Yeah, he gets let out. And then at that point, he joins the Confederate Army as a chaplain.
Right. For the 3rd Missouri Infantry Regiment. He was there at the Battle of Vicksburg, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and most notably the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. Before the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, so the Battle of Franklin, it was the last major Confederate charge of the Civil War. It was a disaster. Before they charged the Union forces at the city of Franklin, he was praying with the soldiers. Shortly after, so this was in 1864. He was evangelizing, obviously, while he was a chaplain, preaching the gospel. There's a story that in Jackson, Mississippi, he got a bunch of Bibles, tracts, and newspapers at the Methodist College there for his soldiers. I'm sorry, this is way before, in 1863. Let's see here. So 1864 was the Battle of Franklin. And it wasn't much longer. Oh, I'm sorry. I think it was either in 1864, like shortly after the battle, or 1865, early on. That he was asked. I think he was captured again.
Yeah. So
that's right. Because he was stayed there at Franklin to bury the soldiers.
So if you remember, the Civil War ended in 1865 around April. I think this was
it ended a little sooner in the West.
Yeah, and this was, I believe, right near the end of 1864.
Right.
And this was, if you remember, Sherman's March to the Sea. This was one of General Hood was the one fighting him.
Right.
One of his last attempts to try to stop it. And like you said, it was a disaster. A whole bunch of Confederates died and were wounded.
1,500.
And
1,500 men died.
And E.M. Bounds was wounded, actually, in this battle, and he was captured. But so the Union, though, knew that the war was almost over, and most of the Confederate soldiers did too. So it was basically, if you take this oath of loyalty to the Union and promise you won't fight anymore, you can be free. And so he, along with most of the other soldiers, just took the oath, and they're let go.
Right. So So then after the war, he began being the pastor of a Methodist Episcopal church in Franklin. He served there for 2 years, and he was very very heavy on personal holiness, on serving the poor. Actually, they didn't really like him, at least at one of his pastorates. Maybe that's not the right pastorate. He was kind of, because his denomination was actually going a little liberal.
Yeah, that becomes more of a thing later.
And actually,
in his life.
So this is 1860s, but then in 1870s, it really was starting to indulge the false views of higher criticism, of viewing the Bible as not truly inspired.
We did an episode on this with like modernism, and we really touched more on like the early 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s. But this is the same thing happening. It's just on the early side of it.
Right. So he helped, obviously, after the war there in Franklin. There was many dead. The town was devastated by the battle that had taken place there. He helped to comfort the people and rebuild. He became an elder in 1866, the year after the war, and then he went to Selma, Alabama, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Ofuala, Alabama. And he was one of those people because this was during Reconstruction, and a lot of the Southerners were very hostile and had a lot of animosity towards the Union soldiers that were there, assigned there to keep the peace and so on, and to enforce Union laws and things like that, and to ostensibly help the slaves that were there and make sure the former slave masters didn't abuse them. So Bounds was very kind and forgiving towards the Union people, towards the Northern people. He was kind of a peacemaker, trying to encourage the Southerners to love their former enemies. And around that time, late 1860s, while he was conducting a funeral, he met his first wife, Emma Barnett. They were married soon afterwards. She was actually the daughter of a Methodist pastor, A.W. Barnett, and he went around that time, late 1860s, he went to St. Louis to pastor St. Paul's Methodist Church South. He actually served there for 4 years, and the bishop, so in the Methodist Episcopal Church, it's called Episcopal because it holds to the Episcopalian form of church government, where you have a hierarchy, and you had a bishop that was over a specific region that Bounds was in, and the bishop realized that as he was the pastor there at St. Paul's, he was a very good leader. He was conducting. A lot of people were saved through his preaching, and so he was promoted. Somehow. To pastor another church, First Methodist Church of St. Louis. Okay, here's where he was not appreciated that much, because he was so insistent on personal holiness and on helping the poor. His congregation didn't really support him that much, so he left after 1 year of serving there. So the bishop was just trying to see how he would do in a more prestigious, a more influential position. He moved back to St. Paul's, where he served for 2 years until 1883, when he was asked by the Methodist Episcopal Conference to serve as the associate editor of the St. Louis Advocate, which is a Christian publication. It must be 1873, not 1883. I was wondering why that's 1873. Then in 1877, he had been married to Emma Bounds for 14 months. Their first daughter was born. Then 2 years later, another daughter was born, and then their son Edward was born in 1884. But Emma, by 1884, was sick, and she went to Ufola, I think that's how you pronounce it, to get better because of the warmer climate, but she died in 1886, and he was the father then of 3 children who were 8, 6, and 2. And he loved her dearly, but not too long after, she actually made him promise that he would marry her cousin, Harriet Barnett. So in 1887, they were married. She was 21 years younger than him, but they had a happy marriage. They had several more children. He was 52 years old by this time, and their first son together was in 1888. They had Samuel Barnett Bounds, named after her dad. And then around this time, he was given the assistant editor position of the Christian Advocate, which is another popular publication of his denomination. So this is the time where you're getting a lot of Christian like magazines, journals with devotionals and updates on the denomination, and this was one of those for the Methodist Episcopal South denomination. And he was preparing to go to Nashville. They had another son. Their son Edward died.
Edward's from the first marriage.
Right, from the first marriage.
But then not very long after that, another younger son died from the second marriage. So basically, in the course of a few years, he lost his first wife, one of a 6-year-old son, and then a 1-year-old son.
Right.
And this was obviously a very hard time for him, and I think definitely played a role in his. Not that he wasn't already devoted to prayer, but I think it really turned him more towards the Lord. And as you can imagine, I mean, I can't imagine, but that would really make you seek.
Although it was common back then.
It was
to have
common.
Children die young.
It was, yeah.
Unfortunately, so they're kind of used to it. It was something.
Well, I don't know if you ever
something
get used to
expect
it.
Right. I'm used to hearing about it at least.
Yeah.
They did have 5 surviving children, and he moved to Washington, Georgia. So he was a firebrand in his denomination, calling out the modernists, the liberal views that were encroaching on the views of biblical inerrancy, on the authority of Scripture, on the sufficiency of Christ's atonement, on the reality of hell. And he was speaking out against those in his writings, in the journal and elsewhere, writing to people and things. So his denomination didn't really like him to be a part of them. And so in 1894, he resigned his position as the editor of the Christian Advocate, and he moved to his in-laws' house in Washington, Georgia, to pray, write, and preach as people gave him the opportunity.
Yeah. So this was quite a saying no to the world, I guess. With basically, so he gave up a pretty good salary. He gave up a pension, and just said the Lord will provide. And yes, his in-laws were fairly wealthy. Actually, they were very wealthy. And so they said, yes, you can come and stay with us. And the thought was that it wouldn't be that long.
Yes. That's right.
And actually, this was very humbling to E.M. Bounds. I mean, he's obviously
60-something years old.
Yeah, 60-something years old, and he's relying on his in-laws, and he's moving to Georgia, which is actually, and he wasn't. At first, he was not viewed very kindly by the people around him. They're like, yeah, he's kind of like a carpetbagger, even though he wasn't.
Right.
But as a Missouri person, he was, even his accent seemed northern to them.
Right.
And he's just kind of mooching off his wealthy in-laws. So it was hard for him, and he had to. It was, like I said, it was humbling, and to just kind of eat that and see what the Lord was going to do.
Right. This is when he started devoting himself more to prayer. 3 hours of prayer every day as his schedule. He would get up at 4 a.m. and pray until 7. How he came up with 3 hours being what was right for him, we don't really know, but that's what he did for several years.
Yeah, for the rest of his life.
He did not get many people asking him to preach the gospel, although it happened occasionally where he would be sent on preaching engagements to preach the gospel. A
little story about I don't know. You can come
Homer
back
Hodge?
about Homer Hodge. When Homer Hodge met him, so he had been invited to preach to someplace. I forget
Right.
where it was, and wherever he was staying, he was sleeping in the same room as Homer Hodge. And so it was like a 3-day thing. And so Hodge.
Now Bounds at this point is 70 years old.
Okay.
Just to give a reference.
And so Hodge hears him preach the first day, and it's something on like prayer, and so he doesn't really think too much of it. You know, Hodge doesn't. But so then the next morning, he's sleeping. They're sleeping in the room, and at 4 a.m. this guy gets up and starts praying. And he's like, "That's weird. You know, well, surely it'll pass soon, and we can go back. I can go back to sleep," because he can hear him like weeping and he did it for 3 hours, and Hodge is like, wow. And so then that day later on, the guy gets up there and talks about prayer, and Hodge is like, all right, I'm paying attention a little bit better. Then the next morning, he gets up at 4 and does it again. He's like, he does this every day? And so by the end of the conference, Hodge is like, hanging enraptured on each word to be like, this is a man that knows about prayer. And they became very, very good friends. Basically, Hodge became Bounds became a mentor to Hodge, and which was actually something that Bounds had been praying for. He'd have people that he could disciple, as an older Christian, and Hodge joined him in this crusade to pray every day from 4 to 7, and to try to find other people to join. Not necessarily that they were together every day, obviously, though when they were in the same town they would do it together. To find other people to join them in this, to pray every day from 4 to 7 a.m.
Just to give a note on his prayer habits, this is not the first time that he was devoted unusually to prayer. When he was a pastor early on, I think it was after the Civil War in St. Louis, he would gather a group of men, six men. Yeah. I'm sorry, in Franklin. He gathered a group of 6 men who believed in prayer, and every Tuesday night they would pray. They would pray for revival for hours on end. And during that year, the revival came, and many people were saved. For several weeks, they preached, and many people were saved in Franklin. So that's just kind of the first instance of his experience of the power of prayer to shake things up, to bring revival. Hodge wanted to publish what Bounds is writing. So as he's spending his time as an old man at his in-laws' home,
and when you at this, not too long after they stayed, maybe within 5 years, his in-laws passed away. And they inherited the house.
Gotcha.
And so at this point, it's just him and his wife's house and their children. And at some point too, they have grandchildren that are living there with him.
Yeah. So his habit would be his prayer for 3 hours.
Oh, a little something on that too, with the grandchildren and the prayer. So everybody in the house would get up at 4 a.m. and join him in prayer for maybe an hour, and then he would continue in prayer, and they would. But so it was funny that. There were times when his kids or his grandkids would have friends over for the night.
Oh, yeah.
And they'd be like, and at 4 a.m. they're getting shaken awake. And they're like, what's going on? And it's like, no, it's prayer time. We always pray at 4. And they'd come downstairs and they'd have to pray and be like, what a strange house,
Mm-hmm. But that was his habit. So he'd pray for 3 hours, and then he'd lead his family in a Bible reading / singing time. Casey, is your water leaking? Or is that just condensation?
Oh, a little bit. I'll clean it up after.
All right, no problem. Then after his family devotions, or whatever you want to call it, then he would write for the rest of the day. So basically, he was praying and writing most of the time, and that's where we get a bunch of his books. So his friend Hodge published his books. He only lived to see 2 of them published. They were called Preacher and Prayer and the Resurrection in the year 1907. Then in 1913, which is that oh no, I was trying to think of how that related to the Wright brothers flight. That was in 1900 something.
1903.
Right.
But so the Preacher and Prayer one is now more commonly known as Power Through Prayer.
Right. Yeah. He died in 1913 in August. The last notes he sent to Hodge were words of encouragement like, let your mind live in the spirit of prayer. God will manage your affairs if we will be filled with his affairs. And then a final note written in Hattie's hand, his wife. Tell him he's on the right line, press it, have a high standard, and hold to it. So let's talk a little bit about his views of salvation and ministry and his writings. Like we said, he was a Methodist Episcopalian pastor, so he was very it's very similar to Anglicanism, to be honest. So he had a very the very typical Reformed view of him the preacher being the consecrated individual who is closest to God, basically, and he represents God to the people, and when they come, he ushers them into the presence of God. So we have to keep that in mind, that he was, he had this clergy-laity distinction, which many people do. Nevertheless, although I would disagree with that he was obviously very faithful to preaching the gospel, to helping the poor. As a Methodist, he would be more towards the emphasizing free will, and also he advocated entire sanctification, where you could be like close to perfect, basically. You could overcome basically any sin, and however, he did have very strong views, very biblical views on original sin. He wrote this in an article called Original Sin. He wrote, rationalism has swept over the land and for a while hidden the truth. We admit the changed attitude toward this doctrine, but the change is no greater in regard to original sin than it is toward the inspiration of the Bible, the atonement, the resurrection of the body, or the eternal punishment of the wicked. So you see those teachings there were being challenged by modernists or liberals. All these doctrines, he says, for the time being are weakened, perverted, obscured, or denied. Every doctrine of the Bible that is not continuously preached dies out of the faith of the people. This age requires a loyal and militant campaign for God's great truths. An unsheathed sword is the only preserver and defender of God's truth. A militant ministry, aggressive at every point with holy boldness, is the only conserving force for God's real truth. He also said, the ministry that does not edify is a failure. His denomination was trying to be at peace with liberals, with modernists, and he spoke out against this. Something also on his view of slavery, like you said. One thing to just show that he was compassionate and tolerant towards black people or African Americans, whatever you want to call them. He actually married a black couple after I think it was somewhere around the Civil War. I think it was after the Civil War. He married them because they were friends. And that was something that was very shocking to the church there. Something he wrote here that I think on his view of sanctification, he says, and of regeneration or being born again. So he emphasized being born again. He said that man was depraved, man's natural spirit and foundations are all crooked and warped when the straight edge of God's law is laid to them. So everyone must be born again. You can do nothing good to be right with God. And actually, it seems to be that he was pretty insistent on God's sovereignty. He also says, the real Christian loses relish for worldly ways, the ways of folly, of indulgence, and of sin. And also, he spoke out against shallow and timid and watered down evangelism. He wrote in an article, we will not allow a desire to flee the wrath to come to have any place as a convicting force in our new religion of taste and sugar. And then he further said, we are reaping some of the fruits of the insane and suicidal attempt to rule the world without authority, to make a God without justice, and to cultivate a religion without fear. So you can see there in his denomination, obviously there was a lot of compromise. And
you can see how this is tied right to today too. Right. I mean, a God without justice, a religion without fear. That's that's a lot of the type of religion that the mainstream would try to push today.
Right. There was another quote from his book. So all in total, so obviously 2 books were published while he was alive. 1, 2, 3, 4.
And also, just to say on those books, especially the Power Through Prayer one, is, well, while you may never have heard of E.M. Bounds, that book was a big book. I mean,
It's not actually large.
I didn't mean large. I mean
Influential.
very influential. There's at least hundreds of thousands of people have read it. So it's not like this is a completely obscure man.
Right. Right. If you look up Ian Bounds on like Bible study websites, you're gonna find his free resources from him.
Yeah.
Like if you ever look up any classics on prayer, he's gonna have his stuff in that section. Another thing he wrote about like relying upon prayer in his book, The Weapon of Prayer, and the chapter entitled The Necessity for Praying Men. He says, "This is the day of great wealth," and I thought this was just very appropriate and relevant to our situation today as Western Christians. He wrote, "This is the day of great wealth in the church and of wonderful material resources. But unfortunately, the affluence of material resources is a great enemy and a severe hindrance to strong spiritual forces. It is an invariable law that the presence of attractive and potent material forces creates a trust in them, and by the same inevitable law creates distrust in the spiritual forces of the gospel. They are 2 masters which cannot be served at one at the same time. For just in proportion as the mind is fixed on one, it will be drawn away from the other. The days of great financial prosperity in the church have not been days of great religious prosperity. Moneyed men and praying men are not synonymous terms." So, if you read his books, a lot of the time he's saying pretty much the same thing in different words over and over again, which is you need to pray more. Prayer is essential. If you don't pray, God is not going to work. And especially because he was a preacher, he was very more focused on preachers, on Bible teachers and evangelists, that they would be praying. And obviously he prayed for three hours a day.
Yeah.
3 hours a day, almost straight.
Yeah.
So
I've got a couple notes on his life. One, sorry, what was I thinking?
On his life.
Yeah. So he was very generous, and like even though he had given up the preaching job and they didn't have a lot of money, if anybody ever came to their door and asked, he would basically tell his wife to give whatever we have. And say, if we run out of stuff, the Lord will provide, just like the Lord's providing for the person that came and knocked on our door. And so he was very generous. One thing that I think may have been a weakness, though it's hard to say, but he did have a couple of his children did not keep the faith, kind of rebelled against him. Partially, I think they kind of claimed as like he's a little bit too militant in like the discipleship, in that like again, I don't know what the circumstances were, but I can see a child being pushed away a little bit by waking him up every morning at 4, like that type of thing. So just to say, don't get all excited to wake up your kids at 4, but though you should teach them to pray, right. And maybe that'd be good for them, but just use discernment in that.
Right. On his trust in the Lord for material resources, there's a story where he took one of his sons on a preaching trip, and he didn't have enough money to pay for the train ride. So this is his son Osborne recalling it. He says, "Once when I was a boy, we were traveling on a train. My father did not have enough money for the fare, and I was worried as to how we were going to travel. When the conductor came by, my father reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins and told the conductor to take us as far as the coins would allow. The conductor looked at my father in amazement and told him that he would have to put us out in a field. My father stated that he, the conductor, would have to do as he must, and proceeded to enjoy the train ride. After a while, however, a total stranger came up to my father, introduced himself, and offered to pay his train fare." This is actually there's a similar story from a famous pastor and preacher in England who basically he just went on a train without any money with a friend, and he just told the friend, "Watch this." And so the total stranger came up to him and paid for their train ride.
No, don't count on prayer for such things.
Well, at sometimes, because here's the thing.
No, let's put it this way. Don't put the Lord to the test just for the sake of putting the Lord to the test.
Right, not for the sake of putting the Lord to the test, but Bounds thought that this was the Lord's will for him to go there. And so he asked the Lord on that basis, because you, Lord, want me to go here, you're going to provide the fare, even though I don't have enough.
Well, and his attitude towards that was, even if we get put out in a field somewhere, it's the Lord's will that we're in that field, and we're going to be there for a reason.
Right. But obviously the Lord wanted him to go to that preaching or wherever he was planning on going. Let's see. What else about Bounds? Oh, just to give some comparisons to Bounds, as to show that this is not unusual for it's not like he got this idea of praying for 3 hours straight from his own head. This has been common. Like Martin Luther, there's a famous quote, says, I have so much to do every day. This is just a paraphrase, actually. I have so much to do every day that I will not be able to do it unless I spend 2 hours in prayer in the morning. At least two extra hours in prayer, or something like that. Also, David Brainerd was a man of prayer. He would spend hours on end in prayer. He was an evangelist to the Native Americans in the colonial the colonies in New England. Also, let's see, Leonard Ravenhill was a man of prayer. Well, he was after Bounds, after his time. But Leonard Ravenhill kind of got his ideas from Bounds as well. Jonathan Edwards was also devoted to prayer. You had many Methodists that had this custom of praying for long times, long sessions at a time. Just to give you a background on that sort of thing. His books are very good. I would recommend them if you need encouragement for prayer. Read them devotionally. You don't have to read them holistically, like read a lot of them at a time. But yeah, so we just as a to balance, like Casey just said. Obviously, I think prayer is a lot more important than we realize as Western or American Christians. And there was a day when there would be a regular prayer meeting every week, like a midweek prayer meeting for most churches. That's just gone for the most part. Maybe we should get back to that. We should certainly devote ourselves more to prayer, more spending time thinking about our lives in the light of God's word, in the light of God's promises, and asking the Lord to work on our behalf and on the behalf of others. I think that's a huge thing that we need to be more devoted to prayer for one another.
Yeah, and I would recommend too to specifically schedule prayer.
Right, like Bounds did.
Yeah, like Bounds did. Because if you just say, well, I mean to pray at some point, it either doesn't happen or it doesn't happen nearly as much as you mean to. But if you have it scheduled, then you just do it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then we should also remember, I think for Americans and for Westerners, largely we just don't pray enough. We don't think we don't think enough about prayer.
Well, and I think part of it's
we don't pray for things enough. Even just little things.
And I think part of it is just kind of that individualized movement of, I can do whatever I can for myself. And so I think the natural tendency of us, especially now, is to do whatever we can, and then if we can't do something, then we could pray for it instead of praying for everything first and realizing that everything is coming from the Lord.
All right, and we also get into a mentality where we just get into a routine where we're just doing things because they're habits.
Yeah.
And we're not actually thinking about them in the light of what God's word says about our lives, how we're supposed to be living, what our goals are supposed to be. Because we're just living the American Western way of life, and we're not actually pursuing, for example, making disciples like we're supposed to be, and encouraging other believers and so on. And we also don't care enough about other believers. We don't pray enough for them, I'd say, in a large part. So devote yourself to praying for other believers. If it helps you, keep a prayer journal. Write down your prayer requests and write down answers to prayer. But at the same time, obviously, prayer without works is dead.
Yeah.
I say because you can't just simply pray for things and expect God to do everything.
Yeah.
But you actually have to be used by Him to answer your own prayers.
Well, and also like to be wary too of letting your prayer just become kind of a checklist of like, let me pray about this and this and this and this and this and check, you know. But to actually be in a relationship with the Lord, speaking with the Lord, hearing from the Lord.
Prayer is a time not simply to ask for things, but to, as Scripture says over and over and over again, when it talks about prayer, giving Him thanks for the good things you have, recognizing who He is, reminding Him of His promises that He's made for us, and giving praise to Him, just describing how good He is, the good things about Him, and also prayer, as we see often in Scripture, it's a way of reasoning with the Lord. It's a way of giving Him reasons to answer your requests, not simply asking for things because you simply want them, but telling Him why He should do what you're asking Him to do.
Aligning ourselves with His will.
Right.
That, that the Lord will change us so that we desire what He wants to desire, what He desires. Sorry.
Right, and that means we have to be in the Word.
Yep.
That means that we have to be basing our prayers on what God's Word says and what Scripture says. So, and E.M. Bounds did this very well. And so I recommend you read his books, take one of his books. They're very cheap, or I believe you can even get them for free online. Just get a PDF or an ebook.
They were written before copyright came
or
out.
Or an ebook version, and they never copyrighted them for some reason. But so that's E.M. Bounds and Philip Bliss, two men of God. One of them a songwriter, hymn writer, itinerant evangelist, a layman, so-called, who preached the gospel through his music, gave us so many good hymns. Look them up. And then E.M. Bounds, a man of prayer, who taught us how to pray and how to rely upon the Lord for power in preaching and in evangelism and the salvation of people and the glory of Jesus.
And I'd say one of the things that really struck me for both of them was just their lack of concern for the things of this world, for money and for how they were going to provide, because they both had families,
right?
And both of them basically left their secular occupation to dedicate themselves to the work of the Lord, and just were basically like, the Lord will provide. And like we said with Bliss, he, as royalties were coming in, he just gave them right back.
Right.
And we see with Bounds, he gave up his pension, he gave up his salary, and it was anytime anybody would come, he'd give whatever. And
that was an issue of conscience for him, because he didn't want to be aligned with that denomination that was now compromised and heretical.
But basically, for both of these men, they refused to be bought by the world.
Right. However, on the other hand, everything we do as a believer, no matter how secular it may seem, if you do it for the Lord and you're doing it for His purposes, it doesn't matter if you're a janitor, like cleaning bathrooms, cleaning hotels, whatever you're doing. Like, you describe any number of things. If you do work a blue collar job that is as secular as you can get, if you're doing it for the Lord, you're doing the Lord's work. And the money that He provides through that is the Lord's money.
Unless it goes against the word of the Lord, then you should consider another option.
Right. So thank you for listening to another episode of the King's Hand in History podcast. We hope you enjoyed this. We pray that you would be more devoted to prayer and also be more filled with praise and learn good hymns and sing good hymns. And they help you. Please do not ignore the richness of what the Lord has provided through people like Philip Bliss with the songs we have.
I would say too, to be careful about what music you listen to,
right?
Because that's stuff that gets in your head and you're just singing it, and you could have very secular lyrics in your mind that you don't realize how they're affecting you, or you can be singing praises to Jesus. Just with whatever you listen to that keeps coming out of you. Yeah,
and we're not old fogies, so like contemporary music is some Christian contemporary music.
We're young fogies.
Right, some Christian contemporary music is good, like Sovereign Grace music. What's another? The Gettys, Shane and Shane. There's another one that I'm not remembering. But anyway, but the old hymns are good as well.
Yeah, and unfortunately a lot of them are forgotten, and there's just so many that are so good and so rich in their lyrics.
And so if you can tolerate King James English, then use them for sure. And if you need to like update the language to make it non-King James, you can do that too. I don't see any problem with that. But thanks again for listening. My new book, I just want to give you listeners an update. I have a new book out called The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity, available on Amazon in print and ebook editions. Also, if you are on Facebook, please check out our Facebook group, the King's Hand in History Students. Please like and subscribe to this and share it if you appreciate our episodes. And please just continue to listen. And until next time, keep looking for the King's Hand in everything. And God bless.